Hi, students. So right now we are going to review the second half of The Giver. So this would cover chapters 15 through 23. This is in preparation for your final exam. So here we are, this second half of The Giver. So in chapters 15 and 16, Jonas gets a memory of the Civil War. And the way that we know it's the Civil War is because of the description of the soldiers, the wearing of the blue and the silver, right, or the gray, as well as the idea that they were young and they were out on the field. There's several different things. I should have had my paper here ready. Sorry. Um, so he gets this memory of Civil War, and it's his first, like, truly painful memory as far as seeing death, right? He had not seen death before that. And so when he watches the boy on page 150, when he heard him, calling out for water, and when he heard him just look sort of desolate and dirt streaking down his face. And then finally, the boy just stopped moving, right? He kept asking for water and then he just stopped moving. So, also, there's some other information to tell us that it's the Civil War. There's a sentence that said, "A wild eyed horse, its bridle torn and dangling, trotted frantically through the mounds of men, tossing its head, whining in panic. It stumbled finally, then fell and did not rise." So, a war that includes horses, that could give us another clue that it is the Civil War. So that was harsh, of course, for Jonas. Then Jonas receives a memory of a family at Christmas. So he thought it strange that there was a tree inside the house. And I suppose if you've never celebrated Christmas or seen any kind of Christmas movie, the idea of putting a tree inside your house would be quite new. And so that's how Jonas felt. However, when he looked at the family, he saw something that he had not seen before, which is grandparents, right? On page 155, he's asking, who these people are. And the giver says they were called grandparents. And Jonas says, grandparents? And the giver says, grandparents. It meant parents of the parents long ago. So as we know in the community, Jonas doesn't have any grandparents, right? The family unit is just a mom and a dad and a son and a daughter, and that's it. You don't have an extended family such as cousins, aunts, and uncles, and not grandparents either. Now, in theory, yes, of course, Jonas's father and Jonas's mother had parents, right? They were raised just like Jonas is, and those parents are probably either with the childless adults, or at this point, they might even be in the house of the old, but they're not referred to as grandparents, right? Jonas doesn't go and visit them. So when the giver gives him this memory, one thing that's overwhelming for Jonas is the idea of love. Suddenly he knew this word, this feeling of connection, this feeling of family, and this feeling that you really care for someone else. You love them. Which brings Jonas to ask mother and father if they love him, and they're quite offended, right? The idea that he wouldn't use such good language, like precision of language, is so important. So when he gets home, he says, "Father and mother, I have a question for you," on page 159, and he says, "Do you love me?" And there was this awkward silence because mother and father, of course, don't know love. They haven't been taught the word love or the idea of love. They just know that they're a mother and they're a father and they have children and they're supposed to be raising these children to be good citizens. And then, they go to work and that kind of thing. So, father says that he uses a very generalized word. That doesn't have a meaning necessarily. So, and it also on page 160, the idea that the word love is obsolete. They don't share love. They don't teach about love. They don't love. So for Jonas to get that memory, that was quite new for him. So moving into 17 and 18. So now that Jonas had gotten the memory of the Civil War, then, as many kids do, they play war games, right? And when he sees that his friends are playing this game, he completely loses his temper and he says, don't do that because the kids don't know that war used to be a real thing, right? That it's part of history. They wouldn't know because it's not taught. But Jonas knows that it is history. And when he had to go through the memory of that young boy dying in the war, then it made an impact on him, as you would imagine. So when he sees his friends playing war, he tries to explain to them what it is, or he sort of explains, they shouldn't be doing that, and they were like, "Oh, Jonas, you're just a downer," etc. Also, we now find the story of Rosemary, and from this point forward, we will find that Rosemary is actually a big part of the story. So we always knew that there was a receiver in training who failed, right? Now we know that her name was Rosemary and that she quit very early on, and the giver thinks that it's because he gave her too many harsh memories too soon. He didn't ease her into it the way that he has eased Jonas into it. So he's heard, that there was this receiver in training that failed. So he decides to ask the giver because, of course, he's able to ask the giver anything, and the giver has to tell him. So he asks him, um, starting on page 175, what was she like? And the giver gives her high recommendation. He says that she was a remarkable woman. She was very self-possessed and serene. She was intelligent and eager to learn. So he has nothing but great things to say about Rosemary. And the giver finally tells Jonas, because he says, what happened to her? And the giver says that on page 177, that it broke my heart, Jonas, to transfer pain to her, but it was my job and it was what I had to do. And then he said, 5 weeks, that was all. I gave her happy memories and a ride on a merry-go-round, etc. But like you, she wanted to experience everything, and she asked for a much harsher memory. And when the giver gave it to her, it was too much. And so, 5 weeks is not a lot of time. And there is some remorse in the giver's voice on page 178. He says, I had to, Jonas. It was my job, and she had been chosen. But you could tell that he wished he had gone about it a different way, and which is probably why he's so cautious with Jonas and very much trying to end each session on a happy note, right? And then, of course, she requests release. And at this stage in the story, we don't know what release is. We just know that she never came back, right? But when she was released, all of the memories that the giver had transferred to her ended up going into the community. Now, how that works is not exactly clear. You just have to kind of make your own assumptions that maybe people sort of get a feeling of something strange happening and they suddenly have images and visions of something they'd never seen before. Maybe that's how it goes. It's not really clear how the memories are returned to the community, but we know that it was chaos and the giver had to definitely do some damage control to try to fix the panic that was along within the community once she left and all of those memories that he had transferred now were out and open. So in chapters 19 and 20, this is when it starts to get quite real, right? Jonas knows that his father performs ceremonies of release, especially with because he's a nurturer. And so there is a set of twins that were born, and because there can only be 50 children in the community, and there certainly can't be two children that look exactly alike because of this idea that it would cause confusion within the community, which we know in our community, we've all seen twins, right? It can be confusing, but it's not, so crazy that it can't that it can't be, there can't be a solution to it. So anyway, Jonas's father says that there were twins born, and he's going to be in charge of deciding which one is the heavier one and then releasing the other one. So Jonas is still not clear where the twin goes, but he knows that father releases him. So he asks the giver about it. And the giver tells him, well, as a matter of fact, all ceremonies of release are recorded. And because Jonas he has a higher clearance, right? He's able to do the same things that the giver is able to do, has this high clearance, so he could watch the videos. And so Jonas sort of was excited, like, oh, okay. I mean, he felt a little unsure because he thought that his father wouldn't appreciate him sort of like looking in on his privacy. Not that it's necessarily private, but just, kind of spying on him, but he wasn't. However, he's also quite excited that he actually gets to see what happens because it's just part of his training and sorry, part of him knowing more about what happens in the community. So he watches the release, and father, in his sing-song voice, just sort of says, "Bye-bye, little one," and injects the smaller twin in the forehead, finds that vein, and ultimately euthanizes the child. So everything changes at that exact moment. Everything changes for Jonas. Jonas then also realizes that Fiona is also trained in what the giver replied to as the fine art of release. So we find out that two people very close to Jonas, Fiona and his father, both perform ceremonies of release. Fiona with the House of the Old, and father with the new children. This doesn't sit well with Jonas, obviously. He feels betrayed. He feels, confused that how could Fiona and father kill people and not feel anything about it and just come home for dinner like no big deal. So this totally changes everything that Jonas knows. And of course, it's because he's had training. He knows what death is. Going back to that Civil War memory, he saw a man die on the field, a young man, right? So because he can't face his father, he decides to stay, or the giver decides to keep him there and to console him. What we do find at the end of page 189 is that release this whole time has been a euphemism, one of our literary devices. So release has been a euphemism for death, right? So every time that, if we think back about all the times that release was used, whether it was for Roberto, or whether it was for the pilot that was in training, or whether it was that they weren't supposed to use it in play. Remember, Jonas said, Asher, that's it, you're released, because he had missed the ball and he got chastised for it. Well, now we realize, oh, they're not elsewhere. They are no longer living. So, of course, in chapter 20, the giver just has to console him. Jonas is quite angry, and rightfully so. He feels like he's been betrayed. And now he has all this information and he doesn't really know what to do with it. So in chapter 20, basically, Jonas becomes the wise one in a roundabout kind of way, right? Jonas is the one that decides that there needs to be a change. And the giver, for whatever reason, hadn't come up with that idea before. And he even tells him, it wasn't until you brought it up that I even realized that there could be a change, right? So, let me see, I'm just finding my quote here. Oh, yeah. So essentially, chapter 20 tells us the plan that there's going to be, Jonas is going to leave the community, and he's begging the giver to go with him. Like, please come with me. But the giver says no, that he needs to stay there in the community so he can help all of the community members because they will now receive all of the memories that Jonas will leave behind, essentially, right? Also, we find out that music has never been a part of the community. And what the giver has is the capacity to hear beyond. Jonas can see beyond, and the giver can hear beyond. And that's how he knew he was something special. So he hears music. And, we kind of talked about this that, well, it's just assumed that there was music maybe because in our community, music is so prevalent when we hear it in the hallways and we hear it in the car and even on TV commercials. So the idea that music didn't exist at all, one more insight into this very strict community. At the very end of chapter 20, the giver reveals to us that he reveals to us that he loves Jonas. And one of the reasons that he's not going to go with him is because he wants to go see his daughter. So at the bottom of page 202, he says, I love you, Jonas, but I have to go. I have another place to go. When my work here is finished, I want to be with my daughter. Suddenly, Jonas says, you have a daughter? I didn't know. The giver smiles and nodded. For the first time in their long months together, Jonas saw him look truly happy. Her name was Rosemary, the giver said. What? So we can, of course, infer that Rosemary, his daughter, is the Rosemary that was the receiver in training that ultimately released herself. So that was new information, right? So moving into the end of the story, so chapters 21 to 23. So they made the plan, Jonas and the giver made the plan that in the middle of the night, Jonas would, leave his dwelling and meet up with the giver, and then the giver would have his driver take him to the end of the community, and Jonas would get on his bike, etc. And no one would know he was gone until the next morning, and but there would be a note, so the family would go to the ceremony and would think that he was with his friends would think he was with his parents would think he was with the giver. So he had lots of time, right? And then ultimately the giver would relay to the community that Jonas had drowned in the river. And that's how he was going to get away. And that's how he was essentially going to start a new life. Well, all that came to a halt because that night during dinner, it's revealed that Father is going to release Gabriel the next morning because Gabriel has not been sleeping throughout the night. And as we know, at this community, everything has to be perfect, right? And so a child who is sleeping or a child who is not sleeping and is making a bunch of noise and causing restlessness within the family, well, what should we do? Oh, we should release him. So that is the decision, obviously, with Jonas does not take that well. Releasing Gabriel, this boy who has been staying with them all these months, really, and whom he's actually given some memories to, etc. He says, "No, I can't. No, I need to leave now." So the plan changed, and he left a little bit after dinner. So it was still it was nighttime, but it was still sort of light outside, and the whole plan of it being the middle of the night and all the workers were gone, that went out, and also the plan of the giver helping him. So he leaves before the planned day, and he takes Gabriel, which was also not in the plan. So because he takes Gabriel, he takes Father's bike because he needs to cart Gabriel around. So throughout the story, or throughout these last few chapters, his whole process is that he's having to help Gabriel. He's having to help him sleep so that he's not too restless. With all the planes coming along, he's got to keep him warm, but then also make him cold so the heat-seeking planes won't see him. He has to have enough food to share between the two of them. So he's doing a lot of work to save Gabriel, and of course it's worth it, but it's very treacherous on him. And then he sprains his ankle, but he's still having to bike, so things are not going well. And if you think about it, I mean, he's 12 just like you guys are, and he's solely responsible for a 1-year-old kid, right? From feeding him to taking care of him, etc. So it's a lot of pressure for Jonas, and he's doing something he's never done before. He's never been outside the community. Um, we come to the word starving, which is an interesting word that's used to define both how he feels now as well as how he would feel if he stayed in the community. So on page 2, at the bottom of page 217, he says that the word had been starving. You have never been starving, he had been told. You will never be starving. Now he was. If he had stayed in the community, he would not be. It was as simple as that. Once he had yearned for choice. Then, when he had a choice, he had made the wrong choice, the choice to leave. And now he was starving. But if he had stayed, moving on to the top of 218, his thoughts continued. If he had stayed, he would have starved in other ways. He would have lived a life hungry for feelings, for color, for love. So, really, the word starved is being used in a literal manner. Literally, right now, he is starving, he's hungry, they've run out of food. And then in the figurative manner, if he had stayed in the community, he would be starved of love and color and nature. So it's interesting to use that word starved in both a literal aspect as well as a figurative aspect. Then we get to chapter 23 with the sled. And he's basically exhausted. There's barely any energy that he has left. And he comes to this hill, and the hill is familiar, which is interesting. He somehow makes it to the top of the hill. He's barely alive, essentially, at this point, as is Gabriel, barely alive. He makes it to the top of this hill, and then there's a sled, a very familiar sled. And somehow he knew that below there would be a family sort of waiting for him, as well as waiting for Gabriel. So he gets on the sled. He's got hardly any energy. He settles himself. He hugged Gabriel, and then and then they went down the sled. And suddenly, these feelings of joy started coming to him. Right? He had this feeling that he remembered his family, that the joy of his friend Fiona and the joy of his friend Asher, as well as his sister, his parents, and of course the giver. So all of these memories, his own memories, flood into him. And as he goes down the hill, he's going faster and faster. And then somehow he ends up at the bottom of the hill and he hears music and he hears singing. So he's just the last paragraph, of course, it says behind him across vast distances of space and time from the place he had left, he thought he heard music too, but perhaps it was only an echo. A very strong sentence in the paragraph right before, here on page 225. Suddenly, he was aware with certainty and joy that below, ahead, they were waiting for him, and that they were waiting too for the baby. So, in class we sort of talked about some theories about what happened. It would be up to your decision and your conclusion to figure out what exactly happened. How did this sled get there? How does he have these memories? How is it that the community is waiting for him? And what is exactly happening? Lois Lowry leaves it sort of open because she wants you to decide what has happened to Gabriel and to Jonas. So there we go. So moving on, as far as the test is concerned, you have your vocabulary sheet, both the sheet as well as the spreadsheet that you guys have been filling in and giving examples. So take a look and review that. You'll need vocabulary. Of course, for the final exam, you'll need to look at vocabulary from chapters 1 all the way through 23. Not just know it, but know how it's used in a sentence. And then, of course, literary devices. You have an entire book of literary devices that we've looked at. Of course, you have your sheets that has all the devices, but we've definitely made note of a lot of them. So make sure that you are familiar with them and you could identify perhaps a sentence of a literary device, or rather identify what literary device is being used in that sentence. Of course, look through your annotations. You have an entire book of annotations, both ones that we've done in class as well as ones that you've done on your own. So just reread what you've been reading, what notes you've been taking, and that will help kind of put things in chronological order. Of course, read over your summaries as well. Now, as far as your essay, of course, you have your note card. You need to be taking some notes down on that card, which you can bring into the test. Now, you can't write your essay to start, but you could put down some ideas and you can definitely make note of the page numbers that you're going to be using for your annotate or for your text evidence. So you will be able to use your book on the essay. Obviously, you can't use your book on the test, the multiple choice part, but you could use it on the essay. However, your note card will have your ideas that you've sort of formulated before, so that when you walk into the test, with your time limit that you have on the test, you're not completely blanking on what to write for an essay. You've already thought it out, okay? So, good luck, always. Use the force, definitely. Be mindful, and of course, you can do it. We've studied this book for a couple of months now, and we've had lots of discussions. You're ready for this test. No, don't worry. You'll be fine. Just make sure that you've just look over all your annotations. All right? Okay, well, good luck, and I'll see you at the test.